Hello everyone. Last night I ran a session 0 for my campaign and I wanted to talk about what I did so that I assume there's someone out there who's kind of like, damn, I've never run a session 0 before, I want some tips. And if you found this video, I'm so sorry. Welcome. So the first thing I actually did before I ran my session 0 was we have a Discord server, I talked to the players, we talked about their characters, I showed them a map, written some flavor text, and this was all to kind of set the tone for like what I'm actually planning. You might have a campaign which is all kind of gothic horror, like walking through creepy rooms, you know, as the dust settles on the bloodstained floor. Or you might have a campaign which is just like booting doors down. You're just walking through every 2 seconds. There's a dungeon, there's another door, what's behind the door, you know, something a bit more like Sunken Citadel. Or you might have something which I'm planning to run, which is more like you're in a town and there's orcs attacking the town, and later we're going to go to Storm King's Thunder. And so it's really important that you kind of set the tone, and particularly I like using the word genre. I like talking to my players about what genre of a game do you want to play. I'm currently playing in a D&D game, or it should be starting soon, hopefully, which is horror-based, and that's quite important to set the tone, because if you want to run a horror game and your players aren't into that, you need to let them know in advance. As well as the genre you need to set, you also need to set up like some other things, like what is your expectation of violence in the game? Is there going to be like graphic descriptions of people getting their heads chopped off every combat? Or is the most you're going to get some like comic book blood, you know, someone dies and blood spatters up? Is that something you want to talk about? How do your players feel? That will be covered a little bit more in detail later. And also, what's your expectation of a character death? In some games, characters' lives are cheap. You know, they might die tomorrow. Every session, you might have a character death. I've never played in a game like that, but I know some people who have. And you might run a game where character death is very uncommon. You're actually gonna the expectation is you won't kill the players. They're gonna survive through the whole game. A lot of newer players, in my experience, come to D&D with this expectation. If their character dies, the game can be like totally over and like we're gonna stop playing. And I think it can be important to talk to your players. If you've got a newer group, what is your expectation? I always tell my players, I don't plan on killing you, but if you do really stupid things, see my party splitting up and then charging into a kobold camp full of 20 kobolds they knew were there with no plan and died, that's their problem. I can't stop them being stupid. There's consequences to their actions. After we'd set the tone, which happened before the session, but actually once the players got here, we finished our chatting, we rolled for characters. Rolling for characters for some of the players, one of the players kind of already knew what they wanted to play, so it's just of rolling their stats and actually putting it into a character sheet. For another player, they'd never played D&D before, ever. So for them, this was an entirely new experience, involved picking their class, picking their race, picking their backstory, coming up with their whole family. Not that they actually did that because they're a newer player, but that kind of stuff. I roll for stats. I think it's more fun for the players to actually get to roll some dice. You know, you're making characters. For newer players, it's a bit boring anyway. It could be fun to just get out the D6s and start rolling. That's a pretty fun it's like a little thing. I do set of 6, and then something I feel like I've kind of built this up over time, but I tend to have in my mind of I don't like using point buy, but one of the things I like about it is it tends to end up where you've got one stat which is worse and one stat which is a lot better. And when my players roll for stats, I like to create that. And although it can seem really stupid, kind of go in there, edit the stats, and then you end up with, rather than ending up with a character who's got all 18s and another with no numbers, you kind of can equal it out a little bit while rolling and keeping that random element. And yes, you will have some characters. One of my players rolled really well, they're going to have a strong character, but I still put in a 9 so that they've got that, what is your character bad at? Because it's very easy for players to just create whatever they want. They can create this super powered character. And I like them to have to think about, your character might be really sneaky, but are they good at thinking? Are they smart? That kind of question. So as mentioned before, I had 2 new players in this group and 2 I think they said they played 2 sessions of Lost Mines of Phandelver, which are those are pretty new people to the group. And so part of what I was trying to do, and this is something I've had to learn, is help the players pick the class they want to play in the race without making the decision for them. Because what it can be very easy to do as a DM, and I know I did this, there might be some of you older DMs out there who are back in my day, but as a younger DM when I got started, in my head, I'd know what I'd want to pick. So players would come to me and be like, I want to play a ranger, and back when I started playing, I'd be like, why do you want to be a ranger? They suck. And I really struggle with that. And so one of the things I've tried to really do since then is think about, okay, this character, this player, what do they want to play? let's make that work instead of trying to get them into this right thing. If I have to give them some sort of magic item, so the classic example was last night, one of my characters was like, what I really want to play is a rogue who like does like life-stealy stuff. And I was like, one of the players was like, oh, well, you could kind of play like an arcane trickster and maybe take some of those spells. And I just was like, you know what, you want to do that. What's going to happen is you're going to play a rogue, and at some point during the game, you're going to get a quest to get a magic item, which is going to let you steal people's life. And that player was like, that is super cool. I'm so down. And they're really excited to play that character now. And I feel like past me might have gone, you can't do that, and just killed that character idea off. And I don't necessarily agree with the like say yes, but I think that was a really useful kind of move. And another player was really struggling to make decisions on like everything. They just like, you know how I don't know if you've had this, but like a player who just like wants to play but is really struggling to make decisions on like everything. And so what I try to do then is I try to like, rather than just say, do you want to play this, which then kind of leads them with like, they don't feel like they've made a decision, they kind of do whatever. I try to break the problem down into multiple steps. So I tend to start off with like, you want to play a mage or like a fighting class? And then they kind of pick one of those. And I'm like, if you pick fighting, I'm like, do you want to be someone who like hits things with like a giant sword or an axe? Or do you want to be like a little bit sneaky, a little bit closer quarters? And that kind of takes you then, if you've got on one side, you've got paladins, fighters, and barbarians, and on the other side, you've got monks and rogues. And this player ended up in a rogue, and I did a very similar thing later on when they were talking about backstory. I just came up with 5 on the fly. You know, they wanted to play a rogue. I could think of 5 classic rogue backstories, and I just came up with 5 on the fly and was just like, which one do you want to play? And they kind of took 2 bits of that. So they took the classic my parents are dead backstory, and I joined the circus. And they combined those 2 things into my parents died and I joined the circus, which although doesn't sound super like crazy if you're an old player, they came up with that by themselves, and I got the sense they were kind of into that. And that led into one of the other players being like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we knew each other? We're both playing rogues. What if we just knew each other? And I was like, now you will regret your decisions. One of the things I think can get lost when you're making characters for a new game is, as a DM, you tend to have like a really high, I mean, I don't want to say 10, but like I personally have bits about my world that are really defined in my head. Like the way my humans interact, the way my elves interact is really defined in my head. And it can be difficult sometimes when a player comes to a group with like, I've got this idea and I want to play an elf, and I'm like, that's not how my elves work in my world. And so there's some places where I put my foot down and I'm like, if for my elves, for instance, I'll probably make a video about them. It'll be linked up here if it exists. Like I will be really specific. I'll be like, you have to play the elves like this. This is what elves are like. This is like, and most of my players like, those are super cool. But in another case, one of my players wanted to play a centaur, and I've never even thought about those races before in my game. I've never thought about the Fey races because that's just nothing that's come up. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to make this work. I kind of brainstormed in my head. I was like, well, I know my empire and my game that kind of controls the world originates from a kind of more Mediterranean. So what if they've got like the Greek Fey kind of creatures come from there? What if they're like, where there's more idyllic and peaceful, they come from there? And this character, and then I was like, okay, you can play a centaur, but you have to be from this area of the world. This is how I think it makes sense in my world. The character has to fit into this if you want to play a centaur. And that kind of back and forth, in some ways, I think it can help some players who are a little bit struggling to come up with their own character idea, because particularly new players can feel like they've got this infinite character ideas. They don't know what they aren't and aren't allowed to do. And I think sometimes limiting their boxes and saying this is where these races fit in my world can kind of help players come up with characters. Although that's going to be a short part of the video, we actually spent most of our time making characters. We spent the first like 20 minutes talking, then like an hour making characters, 30 minutes other the stuff I'm about to go over, and then 10 minutes like with them like putting on shoes and stuff. So feel totally free to spend like as long as you need on this. If you want to make characters out of the session 0, so it's not in the time, that's very fair. I was just playing with new players and I find it useful for them to make characters with me there for the first time. Makes rolling for stats and stuff easier. The next step I kind of got onto was I started setting like more boundaries. We'd already talked a little bit about like violence and death beforehand and setting the tone, but I wanted to set up like clear boundaries. So there's 3 systems I like to use. I like to use red, amber, green for like different triggers players can have. So like personally, I don't like torture. It really bothers me. Like after the game, I'll think about it. That sucked. And so for me, that's just like I don't want to have in my game. I don't want to like listen to someone describe torture. I don't want my character to experience torture. I don't really want it to feature in the story. Most players have things they like don't really want to come up in their game, and like I feel like it's important to get those out on the table early so you can just avoid them. I've had players come to me and be like, they don't like spiders. And I'm just like, cool, what that means? I'm not going to use giant spiders. That's just not a vibe. The two other kind of safety things I use are I fade to black if there's like sexual encounters in the game. That's more of other games I've run, but for D&D it doesn't come up that often. But if a character ends up having sex with another character, I just fade to black really early, and I talk about like, tell me when you want to fade to black. This is getting too much. We can just fade to black. The spicy music can play, we could know that's what's happening. And you can use fade to black in other scenarios. Like if there's like a violent scene and the players are like not enjoying it, you can just fade to black then, you know. If you're describing someone getting mugged, there's like a dream sequence or something, and the player goes, I'm not enjoying this, you just fade to black. And that lets the players kind of imagination, they can imagine what happened to the level they want to imagine, and you're not left with that kind of nasty feeling when you kind of like over-explain something. And the other one I really like, and this is from Monster Hearts, is where I first read it, is the X card, which is just this idea that you can either be a verbal thing, or if you know that could be an issue, just a physical card with an X written on it that a player can pick up or say to be like, I need the scene to stop. No questions asked, you just stop the scene, whatever. You can talk about it afterwards, no matter what was triggering the player if they want to talk about it, or you can just move on from the scene. Finally, what we did in the last kind of 10 minutes, I wish I'd left longer, but we're going to talk about it more on the Discord afterwards, is how is the game actually going to start? How do the players know each other? What's our next moves? So I'd already sent out a map of the world and given them a little bit of information about different places. And I was able to be like, you're going to start in this town called Ortnass, which is in this area of my world called the Duke of Boyron, which is in the Lore Alliance, which is loosely based on the Lords Alliance from Forgotten Realms, because I'm running Storm King's Thunder, but it's my own kind of take on that concept. And then I was like, we're going to be here. We know 2 of the players aren't from this area, 2 of the players are. And the 2 players and I was like, how are we going to make you guys know each other? So the 2 players who are from the world, they're the rogues I mentioned earlier. They've decided that like one of the rogues, the halfling rogue, was trying to steal from the wood elf rogue and got caught. And they were like, rather than like imprisoning them, like calling the cops, they basically were like, cool. And they've made friends ever since. They were very vague on that. That's why my rendition of that story is incredibly vague. And they've recently, they're very unhappy with the Duke and what they're doing with expanding the town. And they recently stole the hands off the clock tower. They're doing it to prove a point about the Duke had set a deadline. And they're like, if we steal the clock hands, the deadline will never come because you can't tell the time, which I thought was a pretty cool idea, but it's a bit funny that they're now carrying around the clock tower hands that are going to like incriminate them, and they're kind of wanted. They're not like, people don't know who they are, but there is a halfling and an elf wanted for having stolen the clock hands. And then the other 2 are going to meet each other in a pre-campaign kind of session. A session and a half, it's not a session 0 anymore. We've had session 0, it's not session 1, so it's like a session 1.5, you know? I'm going to do a session, just the 2 of them. They're going to meet while Crabapple, our Centaur Ranger, is travelling to the area, and they're going to meet somewhere along the way. So when they arrive in Ortnass, they're already going to be friends and know each other, and then I'm going to come up with some way for them to meet the other group in Ortnass, and then hopefully we'll start something off. And this, like, you can do 1-on-1s, you can do 2-on-2s, you can do 3s, depends how many groups you've got. When I run 1-on-1 sessions, it could probably be a whole video in of itself, me talking about that. I try to kind of keep it pretty short. I don't do a lot of roleplay. It's a lot of narrative conversation between me and the players involved, rather than like a full session where I'm kind of fully in control of the narrative, giving them scenarios. It's more like, hey, what are scenes you guys want to have had before the session? What do we want to roleplay through? Who do you want to have already met? And I find that a really smooth way of introducing players to their character, so they kind of already know something about themselves when they get there. That's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about today. I don't know what this is. I'm just making videos now. There should be a link here, I think, to my latest video, and a link somewhere here to my channel. Maybe subscribe, like,